Yours.
Okay, so I had an idea of maybe looking at families in the Bible and wasn't sure what I was going to do with that or where I was going to go with it, but it was interesting. So I started unpacking this and I wanted to talk about some characteristics of families in the Bible, and then look at some examples and sort of we can discuss this. So I like a lot of discussion on this too because it's not always good. So, um, so 10 basic facts about biblical families. Okay. The first one is the Bible covers a lot of years, 2,000 years or so, and a lot of things changed, but families really didn't. Uh, from sort of the Genesis to, well, Revelation wasn't the last book, but from Genesis to Revelation, Genesis to John, families were pretty much the same way. They were structured more or less the same way, except for polygamy, which lasted in the Old Testament until after they came back from the Babylonian captivity. And then just periodically after that, and they kind of faded away. So that was the one change. So families were always patriarchal, incredibly intensely patriarchal. Uh, the Hebrew, as it says, the Hebrew word for husband contains the meaning to dominate, to rule, and also master. So that tells you something about how they conceived of the husband and the father and his role in the family. The father ruled the household, no questions asked. Some of the things the fathers were supposed to do: decide who the daughters were going to marry, provided for the family financially, in charge of religious training and discipline, and that discipline could be pretty harsh by today's standards, and was responsible for teaching sons a trade. Um, and because of that, male children were far more desirable than female children. And you see this over and over again in the descriptions of families, especially in the Old Testament, where they carefully tell you every son and then mention, and there were daughters, or something. So first sons were the most prized of all. They got twice the inheritance of the other sons. This is not something which is designed to make families get along with each other well when that happens. Um, so if the father dies, the first son becomes the head of the mother and the siblings, although the oldest male relative was the head of the extended family. So it could be a grandfather or something like that. Sons are expected to support, yes, yes. Just interrupt me.
I was waiting for him to get through my first. No, no, like, this was representative of the culture at large, right? Like,
Yeah, this is very much
just that the culture.
Eastern Mediterranean. They were very much all like this. Yeah, and that's a good point to make. They really were. So sons are expected to support the parents in their old age, and this is another reason why they wanted sons. Daughters didn't work, so sons worked, and so as a result, the sons took care of the parents, and so the parents wanted lots of sons because they didn't want to starve to death when they got to be my age. Yeah, it would be supporting the husband's family. Genealogies were always done through the sons. That's how they did genealogies, was through the sons, and so forth. Wives were expected to be submissive. This is a really important characteristic. Wives are supposed to be submissive. They were supposed to bear children for their husbands, support their husbands, including helping in his work, taking care of the home, teaching the daughters how to be good wives. This is what the women did in the families. One of the things that I realized really quickly, point 6, was there's a whole lot more about families in the Old Testament than the New Testament. There's almost nothing in the New Testament about examples of families. A few, but not much. Almost all of it's Old Testament, so we're going to do a lot of Old Testament stuff. We will get to Jesus and his family, though. That's the one example of a family in the New Testament that they actually give us some details about. So this is the point Chris made, number 7, families reflected the culture of the Eastern Mediterranean area. So this is not just a Hebrew Jewish kind of thing. This is, they were part of an extended cultural group, and they were, you could find these same basic traits amongst the Phoenicians and the Assyrians and so forth, We need to be careful, especially for those who tend to be fundamentalists or inerrant scriptural people, literalists, not to just simply grab this and say, oh, this is the way it's supposed to be, because a lot of this is culturally dependent and is not appropriate today. I mean, I don't think any of us would think it's a good thing to have polygamy or to marry your half sister or something like that, which was commonly done in the Bible. The dictatorial control of the father of the family is probably something good to let go, things like that. Families in the Bible were considered communities, and it consisted of everybody. Not just mom, dad, and the kids, but mom, dad, the kids, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, grandparents of all different types, and all kinds of household servants were all part of the family. So in one example, Jacob's family, the Bible tells us, consisted of 66 people. And that's everybody, not counting his sons' wives, because they were girls, I don't know. But the Bible takes 20 verses to list all of these people. So it was a big deal. So the families included everybody, that's what we said. Oh, and travelers and immigrants, people who were passing by, all of those were considered family when they were in the house. Ruth, if you remember the Old Testament story of Ruth, she was from Moab, not Jewish, and yet she was taken into Naomi's household and made a member of the household because she was, coming in, basically a refugee coming in. Concubines, absolutely concubines. We're going to see how they cause problems later on. So the extended family is ruled over by the oldest male. So that was often a grandfather, who was almost always called father, even if he was grandfather or great-grandfather or great-uncle or whatever he was. So those are 10 facts about biblical families. Any other comments about these? Just give you I can't. Yeah, if they had money, they did. If they, yeah. I think they occupied close to the same spot. Like a compound. We might call it a cult. Yeah. So let's remind ourselves what the Bible is. Okay, the Bible is a book about the relationship of God to humans and to the earth. It's a library, and it seeks to explain big questions that seem to be universal over time and in different cultures. Like, what is life? Who is God? What should our relationship with God be? How did the earth and animals and plants and everything in nature come to be? How did humans come to be? How are we supposed to act? How are we supposed to treat each other in the earth? How are we to organize ourselves as groups? Why does life have so much suffering? What can be done about it? These are the things the Bible deals with. The Bible doesn't deal about whether you should wear the red shirt or the green shirt that morning when you go out. I don't think God cares what color shirt you wear, particularly. It's big questions, important questions, I wear the green shirt today. Mostly because it was the one my hand hit when I reached into the closet. So the Bible provides moral teachings to help people deal with the reality of human-caused suffering and despair. And so this brings us then to the next point. Why are biblical families often dysfunctional? And in fact, almost all of them are. The amount of problems in these families is unbelievable when you start really looking at it. And the serious problems they had, I mean, really serious stuff. There's lots and lots of tension in these families, and here's a list of things which seem to be kind of the majority of the problems came from these kinds of things. Childlessness. Not having a child was seen as a judgment by God on your worth as a person. So if you didn't have children, you were a bad person, and it was a strain in a marriage. And we see this all the time, especially in the Old Testament. Polygamy, the Hebrew word for the second wife, literally means rival wife. So that tells you something about the dynamic that's going on there, and that's obviously going to cause problems. Almost always the husband favored one wife over another. That's designed to cause problems. If the husband died, that was going to cause problems because the husband was the financial support for the family. A widow could be driven into extreme poverty, sometimes into prostitution. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with trying to make a living. Hunger is a real possibility. If you remember again to this story of Naomi and Ruth, Naomi was starving to death basically after her husband died. And Ruth came and to support her and the family, and they created one of the most beautiful bonds in the Bible is the bond between Naomi and Ruth. It's a really beautiful relationship they have. Yeah, as a mother-in-law, yeah. After Ruth's husband was dead, the mother-in-law, the mother of that husband, embraced Ruth. It's a really beautiful relationship. So if the husband died, the first son was expected to stay at home until the age of 30 and provide for the family. And by that point, other sons should be able to take over, and then the first son could go out and have his own life at the age of 30. It depends. It could be 40, it could be 50, even 60 or 70. I mean, and if you believe Methuselah, I mean, that's not real. But this is no coincidence that Jesus did not begin his ministry till he was 30. Joseph almost certainly had died, and Jesus was staying at home to take care of the family, take care of the mom, you know. Another problem, rivalry between siblings. Younger son's jealousy of all the goodies that the firstborn son gets. Parents have favoritism for one or the other or some other kid, you know. Problems with children challenging the authority of parents. A lot of times this was in the royal family where one kid wanted to be the king and it wasn't his turn to be the king, and so he launches a revolution, and that's going to be dysfunctional no matter how you look at it. Adultery, which is, I think most people would say that's a pretty obvious cause of tension in the family. And alcohol. There's a lot of examples of alcohol being a problem, and alcohol then and now is just destroyed so many families, you know. So these are some of the things that they're dysfunctional on. So it's fair to ask why the Bible spends so much time recording problems and tensions within the family. Why did they do this? Why did they make a point of having all this kind of tension, these problems? Where are the happy families? And there are virtually none, you know, truly happy families in the Bible. So in some cases, it's used to explain larger patterns of human life, gender roles, for example, or the structure of society, or why there's violence between humans and things like that. It's also a way of showing that even righteous people make mistakes, meaning that everybody needs to rely on God and come to God for support. It provides a list of bad things that we should avoid doing in keeping with the moral teachings of the Bible. In some cases, it's necessary to explain history, and in all probability, it is a response to the human tendency to be more interested in bad behavior than in good behavior. And we look at our popular culture today. I mean, virtually everything is people behaving badly because people seem to like that better than seeing people behaving good. You know, and that probably was true in the Bible days too. It was just more interesting to talk about weird stuff. So let's start with Adam and Eve. And there's a reason for this, because Adam and Eve are the prototypical family that sets the mold for much of the Jewish and Christian things that come afterwards. And there's a lot we can do with Adam and Eve. I have to watch my time because I've got way more information here than I'm going to be able to finish, so I'm going to have to skip some things. But they were of outsized importance because they were the first family. Now, if you non-fundamentalist scholars are agreed that there was no really one person named Adam and one person named Eve. You know, these are allegorical symbols, if you will. They probably weren't real people. Adam is not a name. It's never been a name. It's a Hebrew word which means humankind. So they were saying basically that humankind was created by God. Okay? It's a plural. I mean, Adam is a plural. It's not a singular. It's not like one person. It's a plural. It means a group. It's a collective noun. So in Genesis 1:26, let us make man, Adam, in our own image, likeness of ourselves, and let them be masters of the fish of the sea. It's all plural, right? Let them be, you know, it's humankind, in other words. The reference to God as a plural, let us, because in Hebrew, Elohim is a plural word also. And we could get into a lot of stuff there. Scholars have torn this one apart with enthusiasm. It's possible that we're seeing an echo of an early belief in polytheism here, or maybe it's the host of heaven, or maybe it's the royal we, or who knows? People said all these kinds of things. Eve becomes a name only when the man bestows it on his mate. It's derived from the Hebrew word to live. And so a lot of modern translations just don't use Adam and Eve, they use male, female, or man and woman, because that's the point. So the creation story assumes Adam and Eve are real people, and that they had children, Cain and Abel, and poor Seth never gets mentioned at all, because he was a replacement child, and they always seem to take kind of the back seat. But Cain, as you remember the story, was the older son and was a farmer. Abel was a shepherd herding flocks. Cain became jealous of Abel, feeling God preferred Abel to Cain, and so he killed him. No, they weren't twins. Cain was older, and Abel was second. So they weren't twins. So here's a photographic snapshot of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And of course, Seth isn't even in the picture yet because we haven't got to Seth. But Cain kills Abel. That's got to be in the neighborhood of a dysfunctional family when one brother kills another. After Abel's death, Adam and Eve had a replacement son named Seth. They're not named, but Adam is said to have had fathered additional sons and daughters after Seth. So there were lots of kids. Adam and Eve had lots of kids. We don't know how many. After three, it doesn't matter, and you realize that, you know. Yeah, because Cain was the oldest son, and he felt that his role as the eldest son was being usurped because God was favoring Abel. So these are archetypes pretty much, and not necessarily real individuals. If you look at the genealogies of the sons, all of them found women to marry. Where did these women come from? The point being that what they're trying to say is that men and women had children. That's what they're trying to say. Okay? So the creation story in Genesis reads like an allegory, and a definition of an allegory is a representation of an abstract or spiritual meaning through concrete or material forms, figurative treatment of one subject matter under the guise of another. In other words, you're trying to say something, and you use something else to make that point. That's what an allegory is. So what is the meaning of Adam and Eve in the family? Some see it as an indication of a macro scale of human existence. Men and women have families. That's what we know is what happens, right? And God blesses that, and that's how people got here, And those families don't always get along. It's also the first act of violence in the Bible, and maybe thought, Cain killing Abel is the first act of violence in the Bible, and that may be thought of as the originator of violence in culture. In other words, people could say, look, culture is horribly violent. Where did this come from? Let's have this happen. This tells us that this came in that way. And jealousy and so forth. But some have suggested that Cain killing Abel is possibly an indication of the economic reality of what was going on in the Middle East, where agriculture, Cain was a farmer, and Abel was not. Abel was a herder. And at that time, agriculture was expanding and taking over from herding, from nomadic herding, and was basically killing it. And some people have argued that's what they're trying to say here. They're trying to say that Cain, the farmer, killed the nomadic herder, Abel. So take it for what it's worth, but those are some of the suggestions people have made. Others see it as setting the pattern for what, families are supposed to be like in the Hebrew world. And this is complicated, and we're going to spend a lot of time with Adam and Eve here, I'm afraid, but it is the most important family in the Bible, at least in the Old Testament, and so it's worth that. But as you probably know, the first 3 chapters of Genesis has 2 completely different creation stories. They're not the same, and they're contradictory. They don't have the same information. And they were separated by centuries in their origins. So Genesis, first chapter of Genesis up through the first 4 chapters of the second chapter, first 4 verses of the second chapter, was written by someone who always referred to God as Elohim. After that, God is always referred to as Yahweh. And the 2 accounts differ, often in conflicting ways, in gender roles, environmental view, and the relationship of people and God. So they're telling 2 completely different stories. Okay? So what is the creation story? Well, there is no one creation story. There's also a bit of a creation story in Ezekiel, and of course there's always the first chapter of John, which is a creation story of sorts. So in Genesis 1, the man and the woman were created together, both in the image and likeness of God. This suggests an equality between the genders. They were both created in the image and likeness of God. They were created at the same time. Okay? In Genesis 2, the man was created first, and the woman was created from man. So in other words, the woman was created in the image and likeness of man, not of God. And so that suggests male dominance. So we have 2 different gender relationships going on here. In the first chapter, we can argue for some kind of egalitarian equivalency between the genders. In the second chapter of Genesis, we can say definitely male dominance. Okay? And here's Michelangelo's version of Eve being created out of Adam's rib. Now, these are the two models that they had. Which of those would be accepted is going to have a huge role to play in how society unfolds, right? Well, as Hebrew culture evolves, it evolves highly patriarchal. So that seems to, feel more comfortable with the second chapter of Genesis, the male dominance, right? And people were having more and more trouble understanding the woman of first Genesis, which doesn't seem to be the same woman as in second Genesis. And so in Jewish folklore, really early on, they assumed that Adam had two wives. One was the first chapter wife, and one was the second chapter wife. Eve was the second chapter wife. The first chapter wife was named Lilith. Okay?
That's the name
they gave to it. Yeah, but this was a very strong strain, and we'll see in a moment here what that means. And because they didn't want equality, they didn't want gender equality, Lilith was portrayed as being rotten. The bringer of quarreling and trouble and the nagging wife and so forth and so on, misery from men and things like that. She doesn't know her place, in other words. And so as a result of not knowing her place, she's a negative influence in society. So it says here that Adam demanded that Lilith, and the scriptures say this, it doesn't say Lilith, but it says demands the woman to submit to him, and she refuses. And so she left the Garden of Eden. Okay? That has been interpreted as a strong female character who's going to make it on her own and is not necessarily tied to the man and all this kind of stuff. Okay? And there's a strong tradition in Judaism that women who tempt and seduce men, and I put tempt in quotes because it takes two to tango. Okay? It's too easy to say the women are temptress and the men just get a pass, So, but they tempt and seduce men and are associated with sexual misdeeds, and they're channeling Lilith. Lilith is what's causing them to be that way. She's often described as a she-demon and sometimes called the mother of demons. Okay, so she's not a nice person, according to the way the traditional folklore developed to explain this dichotomy in the creation story. So Lilith does not appear in the King James Version of the Bible, but some modern translations do have her in Isaiah 34:14. I thought we'd take a look at those scriptures. Here's the King James Version. The wild beast of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl, which is what they're translating, that's the female character, Lilith, is a screech owl. Also shall rest there and find for herself a place of rest. The fact that they gender that and make it a female means they're clearly channeling the Lilith character here. This is a part of a long passage that's talking about the vengeance of God on wicked people and things like that. And in verse 7, it describes unicorns in a way that makes it seem like they're real animals. Like they thought they were real animals. So you get unicorns in the Bible too. Now the New Revised Standard Version, which is one of the best of the recent translations, wild cats, that's the wild beasts of the desert, wild cats shall meet with hyenas, goat demons, that's the satyr, shall call to each other, thereto Lilith shall repose and find a place to rest. So they use Lilith here. And then in the translation, verse 7 talks about wild oxen, not unicorns. Okay. So we've got this dichotomy between what a woman is supposed to be like. And the Hebrew world went for Eve in a big way. So Lilith today, it's common in our culture that people decide that they're going to make something to be whatever they want it to be, despite what it really is. We just simply redefine stuff all the time to be what we want. That means Lilith can be almost anything or it can be nothing, but she's amazingly popular in certain circles in our culture today. Especially in people who are all obsessed with mythology and with demons and things like that. She's a real big attraction to those people. And people indulge in horror and darkness and things like that. She's often presented as a, really attractive woman, but has snakes and demons and all kinds of things, coming off of her. But for our purposes, the ancient Jewish folklore understanding of Lilith is important because it's the opposite of what culture was defining that a woman should be. She's the other. Okay? We don't have time to get into all this. This would be an interesting thing to discuss. But we have always defined women as dichotomies. Some people call it the saint and sinner kind of complex or something like that, And this is an example of that. And we could do, the Bible has a lot of this kind of stuff, and we could do a lot of that. But Lilith is the opposite of what culture was defining a woman, wife, and mother was, and so she's a negative example. Okay. Eve, made from Adam's rib in the second chapter, made in the image of Adam, of the man, is in contrast to Lilith, is subservient, and is upheld as the ideal woman in Judaism and later in Christianity. So she becomes very important as the ideal first woman and serves as the model for what women should be. Now, later on, the Virgin Mary takes that role for Christians, but at least for a while, it was Eve. She's given that name because she's thought of as being the mother of all people, because it cements the primary traditional role of a woman to have children. So this helps create the characteristics of what a biblical family is supposed to be. Eve is the ideal woman, wife, and mother.
I think it's interesting that you take the part about Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, right, and the other children, and they found what they think is possible that they married Moses, right?
There is that thread because she left the garden first and went to the land of Nod, and Cain went to Nod when he was driven out of the garden for killing Abel. And so there's that kind of, and that's not biblical, that's folklore. But anyway, it's interesting. Any other Adam and Eve stuff? Sorry, I can't see you guys over here because I should turn a little bit more. Yeah, we don't have time to get all this done. Do we want to do Abraham? Let's do Abraham. Abraham is complicated. Abraham is the founder of the Hebrew nation, the father of the Hebrews, father of the Jews. But he was born and raised here in what is now Iraq, in the land of Ur. And later on, he and his wife Sarah went to Haran and lived here. Okay? And that's where God came to him and made the covenant. He's going to make him of a great nation and all this kind of stuff. And from Haran, he went to Canaan, which is where Israel is today. But there was a famine there, so they went on to Egypt. And so there's all kinds of things going on with his wanderings. Now, first of all, Abraham's wife Sarah was his half sister. They had the same father. Now that's a little weird, and we wouldn't think that was a good idea today. And in fact, later on in the Hebrew Bible, Leviticus outlaws that, but that was after Abraham. Okay, they outlaw sexual relations, which they call uncovering their nakedness. That's their euphemism for sex, with a wide range of family members, including your father's daughter. So you can't have relations with your father's daughter. But that's after Sarah and Abraham were together. Abraham was not a good husband, though, a particularly nice husband. He passed Sarah off as his sister in Egypt because she was considered beautiful. Was that?
Yeah.
Well, she sort of was. Well, okay. Okay, so, but she was considered. Yeah, which hat are you going to be wearing today? You know, but she was considered very beautiful, and he was pretty sure that the Pharaoh would kill him so he could possess Sarah, and so he didn't want that to happen. So he just basically gave his wife to Pharaoh, you know, to save his own life. Probably not the best thing to do in a marriage relationship, I'm guessing. But Pharaoh then paid a bride's price for her, which dramatically increased Abraham's wealth and was the basis of much of his wealth, because he was a very wealthy person. He sold
his sister wife
to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh learns that Sarah is not his sister, but is his wife, and he's freaked out, so he sends her back. And he finds this out because God is visiting all kinds of plagues and horrible things on the Egyptians because Pharaoh is having his way with Sarah. Okay, so this is the punishment. Abraham did not learn a lesson from this because when they went to the Philistines, he did it again. He passed Sarah off as his wife, or as his sister, and Abimelech took her as his wife, and then realized at one point that she wasn't his sister, but his wife, so he sent her back. So Sarah was unable to conceive with Abraham, and you know this story, and they got really old together, they never had children. That's, of course, a judgment of God. They thought a judgment of God. It's not a real judgment of God, but they thought it was. And brought great shame and stress in their relationship and so forth. And to fix that, she had acquired a slave, an Egyptian slave named Hagar. And since Hagar was then considered part of the family because she was a slave in the household, she offered Hagar to Abraham so that they could have children. Hagar gave birth to Abraham's son Ishmael. That's Abraham's first child. So he's the oldest son. Okay. And Sarah had arranged this, but she was still consumed with jealousy and was really angry and was planning to kill Hagar. And so Hagar went out into the desert and took Ishmael with her to save her own life. Later on, angels told her to go back home because everything would be okay. Finally, Abraham and Sarah, you know the story here. It's a pretty common one. In their great old age, Abraham and Sarah had a son named Isaac. And Ishmael, of course, was the oldest of Abraham's sons, so he should have inherited everything. He was the first son. Sarah wanted to secure Isaac all the goodies of the family. And so, and the right of inheritance and all that kind of stuff. And so she didn't want Ishmael to have all that stuff. So she demanded that Abraham banish Hagar and Ishmael, which he did because he liked Sarah better than Hagar. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, Abraham was the father of a great nation, right? What great nation are we talking about? Because he's considered the father of the Hebrews, but also the father of the Arabs. Okay? According to tradition, Isaac's descendants became the Hebrews, and Ishmael's descendants became the Arabs. And remember, Ishmael is the favored son, or should have been the favored son. It's likely this tradition is more allegorical than historical, but nevertheless, it does preserve a historical truth. The Hebrews and the Arabs were one people at one time. They spoke one language. And their languages today are still real close to each other. And they're genetically real close to each other. And so the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and the Arab neighbors is basically a squabble between brothers. You know. And a lot of people see in Sarah's hatred for Hagar and Ishmael the roots of the problems that Arabs and Jews have today in the Middle East. Although, to be honest with you, those problems are not so much religious as they are land and water. That's what the problem is. They both want the same land and they both want the same water. That's what the problem is. But we can see how this dysfunctional family gave rise to long-term problems, at least in an allegorical way. Now, let's skip the rest of the Old Testament and go to Jesus, okay? Does that sound good? We got Isaac, we got Rebecca, you know, Esau and Jacob. You probably know those stories. There's a lot going on there. We have Joseph. We have David. We have
Were you planning on this just one session, right?
Noah. I just kept going. I've been on painkillers. So let's go to Jesus. Okay. Let's go to Jesus. The one New Testament family that we have some details about. There are a few families in the New Testament. The New Testament is not about families. It's about creating a family of all people in the revealed kingdom of God. That's what the emphasis of the New Testament is all about. And the family most discussed by far is that of Jesus. So I thought we should do that. There's clear signs of tension in the family of Jesus, though. Clear problems. One clear example of tension is the account of Jesus in the temple when he was 12. Okay? This is the only gospel account we have of Jesus doing anything when he was a kid. We have nothing else. We have no other knowledge of what Jesus was like as a kid. Bar mitzvahs, which is when a Jewish boy becomes a man, it's a ceremony. It usually happens at 13. Didn't exist at the time, but there was probably some kind of transitional ceremony that was going on. And it probably took place at the age of 13, which means Jesus at the age of 12 in the temple had not become a man yet. He was still a child. So he was under the authority of his parents. That's the key here. He's under the authority of his parents and discipline of his parents. And that's very strict in the Hebrew world. So here he is in the temple as a 12-year-old. The tradition is he was teaching the rabbis in the temple. There's not much justification for that. Rabbinical teaching was all about asking hard questions and making somebody think them through and then discussing them. And this is almost certainly what the rabbis were doing with Jesus. Now, the fact that Jesus was also asking questions shows that Jesus is precocious, to say the least, in spiritual matters. So he was also asking questions that the rabbis were thinking about. So Jesus was extremely advanced spiritually for a 12-year-old. but he's not really teaching the rabbis. One scholar that I read said, it's not so much Jesus learning, it should be called Jesus learning in the temple, not Jesus teaching in the temple. But the point here is, and of course, Jesus says, don't you know I should be about my Father's business? Why are you looking for me? Why are you upset? He's saying this to his parents, right? Now, the traditional interpretation is his parents are kind of thick-headed. They don't quite get it. You know, sure, they should have known Jesus was the Son of God. But what's wrong with them, you know? But one scholar put it this way: Jesus' consciousness that he was the Son of God did not interfere in any way with his filial duties on the human level. He was disrespecting his parents. He left the family for 3 days. Parents are freaking out. All of you who are parents can imagine that's your worst nightmare, isn't it? Your child's gone, you don't know where they are for 3 days, 12-year-old. This is disrespectful to the max of his parents, and he should have been under his parents' discipline at that point, according to Jewish law. So to counteract all of that, the scripture closes with an overt statement that Jesus went back to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. They want to make sure that they get that in there, that Jesus was not that way normally. He was obedient. So Jesus was called the Son of David. That's a messianic title. Okay? He was of the house and lineage of David. That's based on the genealogy of Joseph, Mary's husband. Now, of course, traditional Christianity is that Joseph was not the father of Jesus. But nevertheless, still, the genealogy goes through Joseph. And according to Matthew, there are 14 generations between Abraham and David, 14 more from David to the deportation to Babylon, and 14 more from Babylon to Jesus. Okay? Apparently, Matthew thought Joseph was the biological father of Jesus. He wouldn't have put that genealogy in there otherwise. It seems likely that Mary, there's some hints that Mary was also a descendant of David. But we don't trace the lineage through Mary because she's a woman, even though Mary was the mother of Jesus. Okay? So that would be very unlikely. So she's mentioned in the genealogy. Joseph, the husband of Mary, of her was born Jesus. And 4 times they mention women in that genealogy, but always for polygamous marriages, which they want to designate which woman was the mother, because it's not going to be obvious necessarily. Or in the case of Ruth, a famous woman. What about Jesus and his family? John the Baptist. The Gospels have almost nothing to say. Oh, I gotta get going. Have almost nothing to say about Mary's origin or her family. We don't know anything from the Gospels about this. All we know is that Mary's kinswoman gave birth to John the Baptist, which means Jesus was probably related to John the Baptist somehow. Now, typically we say they're cousins, and we say that the kinswoman was an aunt, to Jesus. But that's not necessarily true. The Bible doesn't say that. This is the only mention of any kind of blood relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. And what's interesting about this is that John the Baptist didn't seem to know who Jesus was. Because if you, in Luke 7 and in Matthew 11, they both strongly suggest John had never heard of Jesus until John was in prison and heard accounts of the miracles of Jesus. So it could be that they were related, but had no interaction when they were kids. And they didn't know each other. But there is historical evidence of tension there. There's a sect that's now in Iran that claims that John the Baptist is their founder. And their literature says that for over 100 years after Jesus was crucified and resurrected, their people, the John people, were independent of Christianity and were in competition with it. So they were competing versions of Christianity in a sense. So let's look at Mary real quick. Oh my gosh, I can't do that. Mary was probably in her mid-teens when she married Joseph. There's a lot of speculation about how old Joseph was. Most everybody seems to think he was older. The fact that he probably didn't live to see Jesus' full maturity kind of supports that. The Roman Catholic Church and others believe in the perpetual and eternal virginity of Mary. So they say that the word which is translated as brothers in the Gospels really should be translated as cousins. These are cousins. And there's also another tradition that says that Joseph was a widower who had children with another wife who died, and he brought those children to the marriage with Mary. Not a hint of this in the Bible. Not a hint. It's just a... What's that?
Were they walking behind Mary?
Yeah, I don't know what happened because they would have to have been there in that, but there's no hint of this. So usually we show, this is what the images we have of Jesus as a boy. He's always alone with Mary and Joseph, right? But we know that Jesus had at least 4 brothers, at least 4. Mark 6:3 says James, Joseph, or Joseph, Judas, or Jude, and Simon. They also mention sisters, plural. So it had to be at least 2 sisters. So there was, at a minimum, 6 other siblings in the household besides Jesus, at a minimum. Jesus is clearly identified as the firstborn, and so he's the oldest. We're going to assume that those are the real brothers and sisters of Jesus, not cousins and not Joseph's previous things, because the word is pretty clear. It means brothers. Okay? So what were relationships were like between the brothers of Jesus and Jesus? Mark 3 relates an episode in which his brothers, who had concluded that Jesus was crazy, came to seize him, and Jesus refuses to see them. He makes them wait outside. He doesn't talk to them. In Mark 6, Jesus notes that a prophet is not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. This is very specific and means that something was not right in his own house. You know, in John 7, it's noted not even his brothers believed in him. And finally, in John 19, Jesus is on the cross and he gives Mary to another apostle, probably John, so John can care for her because there's going to be nobody to care for him. What happened to Jesus' brothers? They should have been caring for Mary. Jesus didn't trust them, apparently. He wanted John to do that. So there's some tension going on here. We don't know what happened to Simon and his brother Joseph, but there's good evidence that James, the brother of Jesus, became a very strong Christian, probably as a result of Pentecost, is kind of one of the guess. It wasn't at the time of the crucifixion, but soon after he probably became a Christian. He was the head of the church in Jerusalem, one of the most important people in the early church, and he probably either did write the book of James or somebody very close to him wrote the book of James in his name. There's a chance, by the way, that he was executed in the late 60s during the Jewish uprising against the Romans because Christians were pacifistic and could not fight, were not allowed to fight. They could not serve in the army. And so at this point, they were still sort of a Jewish denomination, and other Jews were really outraged that the Christians wouldn't fight to help, against the Romans. His other brother, Judas, also called Jude, also became a believer. And there's a book called Jude. It's a really small book and way in the back, that's been ascribed to Jesus' brother, although it was written so late that it couldn't possibly have been Jesus' brother, but it could have been somebody who was closely associated with Jude in that tradition. So at least two of his brothers did accept him. We don't know about Simon and Joseph, though. Or the sisters, who we don't know what they're all about. But Mary was there from the whole thing. Mary was always supportive. She was there at Cana in the first miracle. She was there at the cross. She was there the whole time. So Mary was constantly supportive. Mothers are that way. They tend to be that way. What's interesting is that Mary disappears completely after the first chapter of Acts. She's not mentioned again in the Bible. And that's weird. This is my last example. I'm done after this. This is my example of a happy family. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They were brothers and sisters. They were all related to each other as brother and sister. Siblings. Even as adults, they lived together in Bethany. Okay? No indication that any of them were married, which would have been really unusual. That's how, well, we won't go there. Their relationship seems to have been loving and compassionate. They seriously got along with each other, according to the Bible, really well. So this is our one happy family. Okay? It's also, these were the closest friends of Jesus. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were Jesus' closest friends. He used their house as a base of operations when he was in Jerusalem. And we don't know what happened to them after the crucifixion. They're not mentioned at all. There's traditions that Lazarus became a bishop or something like that, but we don't have any idea really what happened. And that's it. I'm done. Only 7 minutes late. If I'd done David and Noah and all those things, imagine. You'd be here till forever. That's the end of it. Yeah.
There was one more family.
Oh, there was probably other families, but Herod is, talk about dysfunctional.
I know.
Yeah, we could have done Herod. That's true. There were some couples, but they were always mentioned just in passing. There's almost no information about them. So.
All right.
Okay.